Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan analysis of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about expanding the size of the U.S. House of Representatives. Could that fix Congress? One of the most common criticisms of the government, especially Congress, is a lack of responsiveness and representativeness. I think we all have felt that way at one time or another. Now, there are many reasons people cite for that issue with responsiveness and representativeness. Sometimes it's the party in power if it's a party that's not the one that voter supports. The perception of politicians in general. Excuse me, do it again. The perception of politicians in general. Congressional staff being insufficient at responding to constituents. Lack of ability to contact members of Congress and their staff, and so on. And these things contribute to the abysmally low approval rating for Congress. But there is one proposal that you might not be familiar with, though it has been gaining some traction in recent years. And that's expanding the size of the U.S. House of Representatives. We have sat at 435 members, not counting the non-voting members for Washington, D.C. and the U.S. territories, for over a century now. And that 435 total was set in law by Congress in 1929. Could revisiting that law and expanding U.S. House membership be the solution that makes Congress more responsive and representative of the people they are supposed to represent? Today, we explore that question, and included in that is a brief history of the size of the U.S. House, why some activists believe a larger House will fix a lot of Congress's woes, the arguments made in favor and opposition to expanding the U.S. House membership, whether any political party benefits from an expanded U.S. House, and a discussion about the ultimate goals for improving the U.S. House, regardless of whether we support more members there. Let's go. So, the purpose of the U.S. House. Obviously, we got to go all the way back to the U.S. Constitution, what actually set in stone how the U.S. House works. So, the design of the legislative branch, Congress, of the U.S. government was one of the biggest sources of debate during the Constitutional Convention. You had smaller states that wanted equal representation across states so that they weren't dwarfed by larger states. That was what was called the New Jersey Plan. And you had larger states that wanted proportionally based representation so that they were rewarded for being bigger. That was the Virginia Plan. And eventually, long story short, the delegates decided on the Connecticut Compromise, also called the Great Compromise, which put together a lot of those ideas from both the New Jersey Plan and Virginia Plan, and it became a bicameral legislature, Congress. So there is a U.S. Senate, which has equal representation for states. Each state gets 2 senators, and then the U.S. House, which is based on the population of the states. And Alexander Hamilton and James Madison wrote extensively on the U.S. House of Representatives in Federalist Papers 52 through 58. And in 55 in particular, James Madison defended the then current number of 65 representatives, a far cry from what we have now, 435, by saying it would expand as the population increased, which would prevent individual legislators from gaining too much influence. And the number of representatives would ensure that they are in consistent contact with constituents because of the proportionality, so they would be tied much more to their constituents, but also the U.S. House wouldn't become so numerous that passion would overpower reason, as to slightly paraphrase what James Madison wrote there. So the whole idea for the U.S. House was to increase as the U.S. House increased, but they didn't quite go so far as to say, well, this is what it's going to be throughout the rest of U.S. history. They didn't necessarily think all that far ahead. For as prescient as they were, they couldn't obviously foresee everything that could possibly become a problem. But generally speaking, the U.S. House was supposed to become bigger as the U.S. House grew. So how has the U.S. House changed over the years? Early on, we talked about how it was 65 members to start off in the U.S. House, but that expanded considerably pretty quickly, and it changed frequently over time before it became set at 435 people. The first Congress, which was 1789 to 1791, was at 65 members. But then by the third Congress, which was only 1793, 105 members. And then the eighth Congress, which was in 1803, 142 members. And it fluctuated from about 1833 to 1861, the start of the Civil War, fluctuated between 220, 240-ish members. So it grew pretty quickly and pretty considerably so. And of course, when the South rebelled and seceded from the Union, the U.S. House membership went down quite a bit. When Southern states became readmitted into the Union after the Civil War, it went from 243 to 292 members, close to the end of the Reconstruction era that followed the Civil War. So it was 292 members in the 43rd Congress, which started in 1873. And then it climbed considerably over the decades until it was 435 members in 1913. But it wasn't officially capped at 435 until the Permanent Reapportionment Act in 1929. Apportionment had increasingly become a major sticking point between the smaller rural states and larger urbanized states. A lot of that going back to that debate during the Constitutional Convention. Smaller states didn't want to be overpowered by larger states, but larger states thought too much of their pie was getting cut into by the smaller states. And so this schism actually led to the U.S. House failing to reapportion itself following the 1920 census, the first and only time that has happened. And then in 1941, Congress adopted the current formula for reapportionment. But the actual number of 435 wasn't set until, or it wasn't officially set until 1929, but it had been 435 since 1913. Now, as for population per district, that is obviously considerably grown too, even as the U.S. House was growing. So in 1790, there were only about 34,000 citizens per U.S. House district, at least by the best numbers that we have. By 1860, so 70 years later, that had climbed up to 122,000 people per district. Then in 1910, it was 211,000. Following the Reapportionment Act of 1929, the average was 280,000 in 1930, and then it went up to 470,000 in 1970, and then by 2020, it was 762,000, and it's projected to be 874,000 people per district by 2040. So these districts are becoming gargantuan, and that's one of the reasons that activists are pushing for a larger U.S. House. Speaking of which, let's talk about this actual debate, and then we'll go over the actual trickiness of making the U.S. House larger. So I'm going to talk about 6 different arguments for supporting the expanded U.S. House and for opposing the U.S. House expansion. I'm not taking official sides one way or another, at least in this episode. And these are arguments I've heard previously, and then there are potential arguments I've thought of that could be made. So you gotta, even if you do support one side or the other, if you're really trying to debate, you have to think about, well, what is something that somebody else can say that I would have to counteract? And you have to assume that the other side, even if you really think they're wrong, you have to assume that they're going to come up with really good arguments, so you have to be ready for them. But that being said, here are 6 of the biggest arguments that have been made or might be made by people who want a bigger U.S. House. So, number 1, more members means more constituents can be directly served by the U.S. House and their staff. We just talked about the 2020 census numbers that were about 762,000 people per district on average. That's a lot of people to represent. But if you add something like 50 more members, 100 more members, 150, 200, however many more you add, that average per district is going to go down. And so instead of having to serve 760,000 people per district, maybe you only have to serve 700,000 or 650 or 600,000 or 550,000. So the idea is that you can actually serve all of your constituents, or at least close to all of your constituents. Maybe they're still going to be too big for you to actually directly get involved with every constituent, but it's going to be a lot more feasible. And also, the founding fathers did intend for the U.S. House to continue to grow with the population. The Reapportionment Act, the Permanent Reapportionment Act of 1929, that has been set for over 100 years. Before then, we didn't go even remotely close to that long without expanding the U.S. House. And then too many citizens per representative severely limits public access to them, makes citizens feel the government is unresponsive because, oh, I'm just one voice in over 700,000 people or 600,000 people. They're not going to listen to me. And they already feel like they're not being listened to, even if the government does hear them, even if they're at town halls or they're contacting the member of Congress's staff in their home district. They may still feel like they're not being heard. And so the idea is that if you get fewer people per U.S. House member, you're going to get more direct responses by U.S. House reps, which makes people feel like the government is more responsive. And that means more civically engaged citizens because they feel like their voice matters. And according to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, research that they cite said that voters that from smaller districts are more likely to approve of their representative and feel like their congressperson is doing a good job in keeping in touch. So that's one of the first big arguments that you hear. Another argument made for expanding the U.S. House membership is that not just fewer people per district, but the actual geographical boundaries of the district are going to get smaller. So it makes it easier to travel within districts for things like town halls or direct service in the community, or people going to these district offices to contact their local federal or local congressperson. Some districts are geographically quite large, especially rural ones, because the rural areas are more sparsely populated. And so the average is about 700,000 people, but it's going to be spread out over a much larger area. Urban areas are a lot more condensed because the population is a lot more packed into smaller areas. And so less travel within a district would further facilitate closer and deeper relationships with constituents, with advocacy groups, and between their congresspeople. Another argument that you hear for expanding U.S. House membership is that the costs of each U.S. House race would be lower, which would also allow a wider demographic array of candidates to compete and be more representative of the nation overall. So you've seen U.S. House races, U.S. Senate races, of course, but even U.S. House races are just getting, some of them are just getting absurdly expensive. Millions, tens of millions. Even a couple times, couple $100 million, depending on what the district is and where it is. And these large districts favor incumbents and other well-financed candidates because incumbents tend to be more well-financed, and the well-financed candidates are more able to reach the larger districts. They're going to become more well-known by a lot of people by default. So it makes it much harder for contenders, and especially contenders that don't have a lot of money, or at least relatively don't have a lot of money, to be able to compete. So it can make things more of a done deal from the get-go. And then campaigns have to spend less money on outreach to voters because they have less or fewer voters to appeal to. And back in 2000, there was an article from the Population Reference Bureau. Rob Ritchie of what was then the Center for Voting and Democracy, it's now called Fair Vote, he cited research that said that demographically, women and minorities in particular would benefit from smaller districts. Women do better in elections for smaller districts, according to his research. And there would be more opportunities for racial minorities to compete in elections without having to contort the lines. So, more racial minorities that are actually in office. So, the idea is that you would have a more demographically representative Congress. A lot of times, Congress gets lambasted, whether fairly or not, as a bunch of old white people. Another argument that is made in favor of expanded U.S. House membership is that because more members means fewer voters per district, third parties and nonpartisan candidates would have a better chance at competing in these elections. It's been exceptionally rare, especially over the last 30 years, for the U.S. House to see a third party or non-party candidate win a congressional race. There have been a couple times where they've come close, especially the last couple rounds, but they ultimately don't make it. And usually voters believe that voting for a third party or a non-party candidate, again, whether right or wrong, or whether it's right in a particular case, some voters believe that it's a wasted vote to go outside the Democratic Republican dichotomy. Even if they absolutely hate both parties and they think both parties suck, a lot of people still believe in this quote unquote lesser of two evils idea. But if there's smaller constituencies, people theoretically at least might feel differently about these other candidates and say, okay, you know what, maybe these guys do have a chance. Another argument made for expanding U.S. House membership is that it would make more races more competitive. Fewer votes per election means fewer votes that candidates would have to win and persuade from another candidate. The margins of error would be a lot smaller. You have a lot of these districts, over 80% of congressional districts, in fact, are considered safe for either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And regardless of your political views, that's not healthy for democracy. You need competition. But the idea of more members would make more of those districts more competitive because those safe districts would be split up a lot more and make for more competition. So instead of 80% of districts being safe, maybe it's more something like 50%, depending on the number of U.S. House reps you move to. Because there's going to be some districts that no matter how much you cut it down, they're going to be safe for one party or another. But the proportion of those races that are that way are going to be a lot fewer if you add more U.S. House reps. And then the final argument that we'll cover for expanding U.S. House membership is that it would reduce overrepresentation of small states in presidential elections. And so it would give states more equal influence on the Electoral College. So, roughly speaking, the Electoral College is by population somewhat representative, but because smaller states get 3 electoral college votes no matter what, because they at least have 1 U.S. House rep no matter what, and every state gets 2 senators, and so your electoral college votes are made up of the total number of Congress people that you have for that state. But if you're adding more U.S. House members, the larger states are getting more representatives, and the smaller states would get more representatives too, but not as much as the larger states. So the idea is that the Electoral College would be more representative of the population in terms of proportion across states. And there's currently a large variance in population sizes for different districts, partly because these smaller states only have 1 U.S. House district, whereas in these bigger states that have a lot higher of a population, the individual districts might have more people. And then, of course, it depends on how much these particular districts grow over the course of the decade before the census leads to reapportionment. So those are the arguments, not the only arguments, but those are some of the most common arguments you hear in favor of expanding U.S. House membership. But let's talk about arguments against an expanded U.S. House. Again, these are arguments I've heard previously or potential arguments that could be made. So, first one is that more representatives would mean more representatives and their subsequent staff that you would have to pay, which means there's more taxpayer dollars spent on them. The current salary for members of Congress is $174,000 base pay, and then the leadership gets more. I believe the Speaker of the House gets $230,000 or something like that. Then you have to have the funds to pay their specific staff members. And they have people that have sometimes specialized things that they do for their chosen representative that they're working for, but a lot of times they have roughly the same job. It depends on the representative. But then not only the staff for each specific member of Congress, then you might need even more people for to staff the congressional committees, because congressional committees also have staff. So they might need more people to staff those congressional committees to attend to more representatives of Congress. And the overall U.S. House has specific staff members. And then the political parties in the U.S. House have staff members. And all of these people would be needed to attend to more U.S. House reps, depending on how many that they add. So that's adding a lot more taxpayer dollars that have to be spent on congressional and congressional staff compensation. And with a lot of these arguments about, especially with looming shutdowns seemingly every other month for the government and the high deficits that we see each year, it adds to the debate about whether we should expand the U.S. House, because now it's adding more costs to the deficit that we already see. Another argument against expanded U.S. House membership is that it would make it harder to reach majorities on contentious issues because you have to get more representatives in line. And you have, for the majority and minority party, you have what are called whips. They whip people into shape, basically. Tell them, get in line, you have to vote this way on our bill. And so the idea is that Republican whips try to get as many of their fellow Republicans in line. Democratic whips try to get as many of their fellow Democrats in line. But also, if you could potentially get defectors, quote unquote, from the other party that might be willing to support that same stance on a given bill, those whips will contact them as well. And then that party's whips need to work extra hard just to make sure, hey, you cannot fall out of line. We need you to stick around for this. So these whips would have to get more people in line. So they'd have to spend more time with each individual representative to say, hey, you need to stick with us, or hey, you need to go away from your side to work with us on this bill because X, Y, and Z reasons. So more time being spent whipping people into shape, into consensus, especially if you're adding 100, 150, 200 members to the U.S. Congress, or to the U.S. House specifically. Another argument that people make against expanded U.S. House membership is that special interest groups with larger budgets could influence even more representatives, much more so than less resourced groups, because the special interest groups that have more money have a lot more resources to spread out across multiple people, whereas the less resourced groups can't do so. They might still just have to pool all their resources toward a few representatives. And then there's even less competition for those bigger resourced groups to influence certain other representatives. And these less resource groups already have trouble competing, but they do have somewhat better chances at influencing certain representatives because they can focus on fewer U.S. House reps. And also, you spend less time researching who you can potentially influence. Another argument against expanding U.S. House representation is that you would need new infrastructure and more office space to accommodate the larger membership. So you're going to have to build onto Capitol Hill to house more members and their staff, which costs more money, which means more taxpayer dollars, not just because you're compensating this extra congressional membership and this extra congressional staff, but to have to actually add onto the building of Capitol Hill. You need to spend more money. Now, obviously, that wouldn't be a perpetual thing where you're doing it every other year necessarily. But I mean, if you have to upkeep the building, there's more of the building to upkeep. So then that's still costing more money. And then you got other little things too, like adding in furniture and paying the electric bill. So a bunch more costs added on, even if it's not necessarily going to be the case for every year like a salary, you're still adding on a lot more cost. And you also have to devise where these new offices are going to be. So more deliberation on where you're going to put these offices and how you're going to design. And as ridiculous as it might sound, where offices are is a big deal to members of Congress. They do some wheeling and dealing and bickering behind the scenes to get the quote unquote best offices. And when you are a good member of your party and that party takes power, they give you the best office because you supported them. If you're a rank and file, you're a newbie, or you were there already, but you weren't as supportive of the membership, and they become the majority party, they'll probably remember that and give you some faraway office that's much harder to get to. It does happen. You think if there's anything in Capitol Hill that you don't think doesn't get political, well, you're mistaken. Even office spaces get political. Another argument that is made against extra U.S. House membership is that it's harder for individual rank and file members to have a major impact. Now, of course, with 435 members, not including the non-voting members of U.S. Congress or for the U.S. House that are for Washington, D.C. and for the territories, it's already going to be difficult to make some noise. Now, for better or for worse, sometimes it's better that they don't make some noise, but at the same time, can't drown out their voices either because they are there on Capitol Hill. Unless they get out of line, then some people might say that their voice should be drowned out, but what is exactly getting out of line? But even more individuals in the U.S. House membership means each individual member might be less able to act on constituent interests. And that could actually pull more power into the hands of leadership because they are the ones who already have the attention and the prestige. And they can use that on more members of Congress to get more of them in line. And it's a lot less likely that any single one of them might make a quote unquote revolt happen. And then the last argument that we'll cover over people's arguments against U.S. House membership expansion is that more members would lead to more bills being introduced and bogging down the process further. Not just bogging down the process in terms of whips having to reach out to more members to try to get them to vote on the bill, but bills have to be introduced on the floor. The very, very oversimplified process for a bill is it gets introduced on the floor, then it gets in the committee hammers out the details, goes to the full floor, the full chamber of Congress supports it, then the other chamber of Congress has to go through the whole rigmarole, the same thing. They have to agree on the exact same wording of the bill, so it might go back and forth between the chambers. That's the short version of the process for how a bill becomes law. But more bills then would have to be introduced on the floor, which means more time having to be spent on hearing the name of the bill and getting every single one of those bills on the docket. And some of those bills won't be heard because of some wheeling and dealing behind the scenes. And then those have to be sent to committees to be hammered out fully, but then those committees have to spend more time on more bills to hammer out more bills details and vote it on before the full chamber can take it up. And then the full chamber will have potentially more bills to vote on. And so there's a lot more behind the scenes stuff that people can use to try to kill more bills, whether they just simply don't like somebody or somebody is the opposing party or some sort of esoteric procedural rule in the chamber of Congress that we're talking about says, for some reason, oh no, we can't hear that bill because whatever reason it might be. There's all sorts of procedural rules in Congress that are just super esoteric, even to people who are in Congress. And every once in a while, you hear about seldom used rules to try to make something happen. And so you're bogging down the process, not just towards the end, but towards the beginning of it, too, for how a bill becomes law. And then the committees have to have more bills to deliberate on and refine, decide whether they're going to approve or not approve them, and send them out of committee. And then past the committee stage, more bills are having to be voted on. So it can take even longer for a bill that you might be interested in as a constituent to be heard, if it even gets heard. So again, those are not the only arguments that are made for or against U.S. House or expanding the U.S. House membership, but those are some of the really common ones that you'll hear or potentially will hear, especially if this movement for a larger U.S. House becomes greater, gets a lot more traction. So regardless of whether the expansion of the U.S. House is the proper way to address a lot of Congress's woes with responsiveness and representativeness, let's just say, for the sake of argument, we are going to try to expand the U.S. House membership. Well, of course, like everything else in politics, it's quite tricky and a lot easier said than done. Now, it would be easier than some things because certain changes might require a constitutional amendment. And constitutional amendments are extraordinarily difficult to achieve. You need 2/3 of both chambers of Congress to propose an amendment, or the state legislatures, 2/3 of them call for a constitutional convention. And then the full amendment has to be approved by 3/4 of the state legislatures in order to actually be ratified. Enlarging the U.S. House would not need a constitutional amendment because Congress already did that through a statute. They capped seats at 435 in the Reapportionment Act of 1929. And if you're trying to reverse a bill by Congress, you don't need a constitutional amendment. You just need a regular bill. And so you just need to focus on getting a majority of the U.S. House. But that is still quite tricky. One of the reasons why is actually deciding on the number of members of the U.S. House. What exactly is the appropriate number? We're at 435 now, so should we expand it to 500, 600, 700, 800, 1,000, maybe more? There's not really an objective number per se. Now, we can argue about which number is best, but it's hard to really come up with a truly objective, this is the best number to use. But we can maybe get close enough to try to say that something is objectively the best. But of course, there's debate about that. But what if we're basing instead of just raising the cap and still having a maximum number of representatives like that, maybe we're still pegging it to the average number of citizens per district. But then what is that number? We're at 760,000 plus citizens per district on average. So what's the appropriate number? Probably not going to get to 40,000 or 60,000 because then just it becomes an absurdly unwieldy U.S. House. And I don't think even people who are arguing for an expansion to U.S. House membership would argue that we need that many members of Congress. So what is the average that we're trying to look for? Is it 650,000, 600,000, 500,000, 400,000? Again, hard to come up with if not impossible to come up with an objectively best number for that. There'll still be a lot of wheeling and dealing. So even if you have 5 different people come together and agree, oh yeah, we do need to expand the U.S. House membership. Well, all 5 of them might have a different idea of where that number should go. Some of them might support a maximum cap just higher than 435. Some of them might support making it based on average number of citizens. But the exact number of U.S. citizens per district, maybe they still don't agree on that. So even if you come up with a specific number, so if you do get a bill through that says we're going to base U.S. House membership on X maximum number of representatives or this average number of U.S. citizens. Okay, let's say that there's a bill there that's up for a vote by the full U.S. House. How do you get a majority of the U.S. House to support it? They're politicians, so they typically need an incentive to support something, whether it's appealing to their party loyalty or ideological affiliation, or they have a constituency group that is particularly powerful in their district and is trying to influence them one way or another on a bill. There needs to be some sort of, every once in a while you'll get a truly altruistic vote on a bill, but a lot of times that doesn't really happen. And that's not to say that every vote is selfish in Congress. I know it's very easy to dunk on politicians. I do it a lot too. But it's not necessarily because they're being selfish. It's they just have a lot of things to consider. Or there might be a little bit of selfishness to it, but it's not like they're purposely trying to screw over anybody. Not always, at least. But then, even if you get past individual incentives, is the current majority party in Congress going to support it? So whether it's a Republican majority or a Democratic majority in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. Is the current majority party going to support it? They might not, because the current rules got them that majority. And the minority party might say, no, we do need more members and more U.S. House membership in Congress if they feel like that will get them a leg up. But then if they become the majority party, they might suddenly turn around and say, yeah, you know what? This actually isn't so bad because of reasons. A lot of times, parties and individuals change their tune on something when they suddenly get a lot more power and prestige and influence. But then what if the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate are split between the parties? You need to get both chambers to agree on the same exact wording in the bill. So even if Republicans thought that we needed to expand the U.S. House membership and Democrats didn't, or Democrats did and Republicans didn't, well, then you are probably going to be at an impasse because both chambers of Congress are different parties. But even beyond that, even if you did get both chambers of Congress to agree that House membership needed to be expanded, well, they would need to agree on the same exact wording. And again, that gets back to what's the appropriate number to base the U.S. House membership on? A maximum number of representatives or average number of citizens per district? So a lot of things to consider. And also, not even just by party. Talking about geographic in terms of total population of states again. Talked about before the smaller state versus larger states schism, if you will. Smaller states might be harder to get on board because some would argue that a larger U.S. House would reduce the power of small states in presidential elections. Smaller states having an outsized influence, whether it's right or wrong for smaller states to be able to have more influence than their population would suggest. I'm not going to get into that. But them having an outsized influence, smaller states are probably not going to give that up easily. And you might have enough of them, even across party lines, that would say, no, we are not going to expand the membership of the U.S. House if they feel like it's benefiting them the way they are. Because not just party incentives and group incentives, there's individual incentives, and sometimes those individual incentives can transcend party lines. It can happen to anybody. We all have certain things that influence us to feel a certain way, certain biases, certain benefits that we're not going to want to give up. And certainly members of Congress are no different in that regard. They can act on that considerably and have a lot more influence on the political system that way. Regardless of whether we support the expansion of the U.S. House membership or not, regardless of how tricky it is, ultimately, what is this about? Why do people want an expanded U.S. House membership? Well, the idea is it's about making Congress more responsive, accessible, accountable, representative, or some combination thereof, or some other word that I didn't come up with. And all of those are admirable goals that, regardless of political views or whether the party we support is in power, we want that for Congress. We should want a Congress that is more representative, more accessible, more accountable, more representative, actually tries to help out constituents across party lines, regardless of whether those people voted for that representative or not. And regardless of party, the vast majority of us often feel that Congress as a whole falls short of these goals. So, if we keep those ultimate goals for expanded U.S. House membership in sight, but if we can't get a bill passed to expand the U.S. House, can we achieve those goals a different way? In other words, what are other ways that we can make Congress more responsive, accessible, accountable, representative, or some combination of those words? When you're doing policy analysis, regardless of how deep you get into the weeds of it, every policy has pros and cons to it. Now, many supporters of a policy are going to work to convince you that it doesn't have any flaws, because it doesn't really behoove them to tell you, well, there are some things we haven't worked out, but there are always trade-offs. Some policies might have more trade-offs, some policies might be subjectively or objectively worse or better, but there's always going to be some sort of flaw because human beings are involved. And human beings are oftentimes very short-sighted or biased or self-interested. Now, policies aren't inherently at complete odds. They can be supplemental to each other, but that's not always the case. And there are always other ways to at least attempt to accomplish the goals that you're ultimately trying to accomplish, with varying degrees of success, even if one policy is the quote-unquote best. But you might need to implement multiple policies. So, some other ways that we can try to achieve those goals for Congress that advocates of an expanded U.S. House membership would argue for. Maybe you can include something, and these are just, I haven't really thought super deep about these and how you would implement them, but just some things to really get the gears turning in your minds. Maybe other ideas include town hall attendance requirements. Lately, some members of Congress, and really over the years, a lot of members of Congress, maybe not a lot, but some members of Congress get blasted, even if it's by voters of the same party, for not attending town halls because they are afraid of some sort of blowback, or they just don't feel like making the trip, or something else holds them up. Is there a way you can force them to attend a certain number of town halls? Probably not, but if you at least hold them accountable to say, if you don't go to this many town halls, we're going to make sure we punish you at the ballot box or in some other way. Obviously, not anything violent. Is that something you could do? Because if you make them go to more town halls, they're going to be more responsive, more accountable by default, because they're having to hear more directly from a group of constituents that are very involved. What if you simply added more congressional staff to attend to constituent needs? So, yes, that's higher cost because you're adding more congressional staff members, but more of them can attend to more needs of the constituents because there are more staff members to take their calls and emails and physical letters in the mail. So they might feel like they're being heard, and so people feel that Congress is being more responsive. Even if it's not that specific member of Congress, it's still their staff, and that staff represents that representative. What about independent redistricting commissions? So instead of having how a lot of states do it, where the state legislatures, redraw the lines of those congressional districts and state legislative districts. If you have more independent members, and how you would make sure they're independent, that can vary. But if you're taking politicians out of the equation of redistricting, can that make them more accountable, more responsive, because they're not trying to draw the lines in a way that benefits them? They're not trying to gerrymander. A lot of times gerrymandering has become more and more insidious. We've gotten better and better at detecting gerrymandering, but some people can be very sneaky about how they draw certain district lines. What about campaign finance reform? So we talked about the cost of elections earlier, and how more membership in the U.S. House would lead to less cost for races, because there's more campaigns having to have money spent on them, and your campaigns are having to appeal to fewer voters. So is there a way we can do that through campaign finance reform? And that's a huge umbrella of potential reforms. You can't really get into that right now, but maybe one day we'll have a podcast episode about campaign finance reform. But it's not just about changing the behavior of Congress. We can also change our own behaviors, because a lot of times we contribute to the lack of responsiveness and accountability in Congress, as well as the representativeness of Congress, or the accessibility of Congress. We can also do better. We can't just put it all on our government officials. So we can change our behaviors as well, such as being willing to hold people across the political spectrum accountable, no matter what their party is. Obviously, a lot easier said than done, but we do need a lot more accountability. If you're not holding your own side accountable, then you don't actually believe in accountability. Accountability does not exist in that scenario. Not boxing ourselves into echo chambers. Another thing that's a lot easier said than done. We have to be a lot more deliberate about not keeping ourselves just hearing the things that we want to hear and patting us on the back for believing the same things that some talking head on the TV or the radio said, because, oh, they said what I said and I've got everything figured out, so of course they're right. But in any case, need to seek out differing sources of information, or not even necessarily ones that are on the other side of the aisle, but ones that are not just pandering to us, more neutral opinions we need to really seek out as well. Being more civically engaged with politics beyond voting, because the most active people in politics are the ones that are the most polarized. People who are not so engaged with the process tend to be less polarized. So we need to have people who are not so politically polarized to participate more in campaigns. So representatives feel like they have to respond to more people, of a more eclectic variety of people from different parties and ideologies and issue stances. And then also putting more effort into researching candidates. A lot of times we wait until the last minute to research. Hey, believe me, I've been guilty of it too. Now, I obviously am a lot more involved in politics. It's my career is in it, but sometimes I can procrastinate on researching candidates for a local level race, for example, as well. But we need to be a lot better in our research habits, but also teaching people how to research better as well, because not everybody knows how to find this information, if the information is even out there. Information is not always out there. Some candidates you can't find anything on for one reason or another. So it's not just about changing how Congress behaves, but how we behave. Changing that will also lead to changes in behavior by Congress. So, is expanding the U.S. House membership the way to go? Is that what's going to achieve all these things we want to see in Congress? Is that going to fix Congress? Maybe it will. Maybe it won't. Politics is so complicated that it's probably not going to be the only thing. Even if it is the right thing to do, it's probably not going to solve everything. But it is, in any case, something we really need to consider. And even if we come to an agreement that we do need to expand the U.S. House membership, we still need to talk about how exactly to do that as well. So, some food for thought. And that's going to do it for today's episode of the Politics with Paul podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. And please like, comment, subscribe, share. Links to the show notes, my Facebook, my LinkedIn, my email, my website, my medium.com profile, and the stuff I write on there. The 5-day educational email course I have that is free. That is about ways that we unintentionally inflame affective polarization, political polarization in general, why we make those mistakes, and how we can fix those mistakes. And of course, come talk to me. I've got a lot of services to provide in research, analysis. I do webinars. Can even make an educational email course for you if you are a civic and nonpartisan organization. So, love to hear more from you and more from people who enjoy the show, and any constructive criticism you have as well. So, as always, thank you so much. And until next time, take care.